We all know the thrill of discovering a forgotten film, a hidden gem tucked away on dusty shelves or lost in the archives of Hollywood studios. But some stories go further than obscurity. They were literally locked away for decades, withheld from audiences, and almost erased from cinematic history. Behind every film that never saw the light of day, there lies a tangled web of studio politics, censorship, and creative battles, waiting to be uncovered. Imagine completing a full-length feature only to find that no theater will ever show it. Directors fought to bring their visions to life, while producers feared backlash, audience rejection, or even scandal. Some films were deemed too shocking, too unconventional, or too controversial to release. Others simply became victims of corporate indifference, their reels gathering dust as the years passed. And yet, these shelved films hold secrets that still fascinate fans and historians alike. Bizarre plotlines, unsettling imagery, and creative choices that defied their era. From the eerie corridors of the house that would not die to the surreal, unfinished chaos of The Other Side of the Wind, each film tells a story not just on screen, but behind the scenes. What dark realities, technical mishaps, or creative disagreements led to their disappearance? How did these films survive, sometimes against all odds, only to resurface decades later? In this countdown, we will explore 15 horror films that were shelved for decades, examining the circumstances that kept them hidden and the moments that make their eventual release so remarkable. We'll uncover the censored scenes, lost footage, and creative compromises that define their obscurity. And along the way, we'll ask, did the studios suppress these works to protect the audience or to protect themselves? Let's dive into a world where cinematic nightmares were locked away, waiting patiently for the moment when the lights would finally come back on. Here are 15 horror films that remained unseen for years, and the secrets they carried behind closed doors. Fact Hasson, The Killing Kind, 1973. Imagine a film so dark and unsettling that the studio immediately shelved it after post-production. The Killing Kind, directed by Curtis Harrington, was completed in 1973, yet it remained hidden from audiences for years. The film's psychological horror, exploring themes of obsession and murder, pushed boundaries far beyond what distributors were willing to handle at the time. The lead actor's intense performance added an uncomfortable realism that, combined with the bleak cinematography, made executives uneasy. The story centers on a disturbed young man whose violent impulses escalate in a small town, a narrative that tested both audience tolerance and societal norms. Behind the scenes, Harrington fought to retain his vision, resisting pressure to cut key scenes depicting the protagonist's escalating madness. Studio executives, however, feared that such raw intensity could provoke controversy or even legal scrutiny, particularly given the growing public sensitivity toward graphic content in the early 1970 seconds. Ironically, when The Killing Kind was eventually released years later, critics hailed it as a cult classic, praising Harrington's daring approach and the film's unflinching exploration of the human psyche. Audiences who finally saw it were captivated by the very elements that had kept it locked away, proving that sometimes the most controversial works endure precisely because of the risks they take. Fact Hash 2, The Keep, 1983. In 1983, Michael Mann undertook the ambitious adaptation of F. Paul Wilson's novel with The Keep, blending supernatural horror with historical intrigue. Despite completion, the film was heavily cut, and the original vision was never fully released. The studio, worried about its commercial viability and the unusual mix of war, horror, and mysticism, insisted on trimming crucial narrative sequences and ambiguous character moments. Filming had been chaotic, elaborate sets in Romania, massive pyrotechnics, and a climactic battle involving supernatural forces left the production over budget and behind schedule. Lead actors delivered demanding performances amid difficult conditions, while Mann's insistence on a dense, atmospheric score clashed with studio expectations. In the end, the theatrical release bore little resemblance to Mann's original conception, and the uncut version remained unseen for decades, buried in studio vaults. Yet, this incomplete form achieved a cult following among genre enthusiasts who sought the elusive director's vision in bootleg copies. Ironically, the elements that scared the studio, ambiguous morality, graphic supernatural horror, and a narrative that defied linear explanation, became precisely what fascinated future audiences, cementing The Keep as a legend of lost cinema. Fact Hash 3, The Other Side of the Wind, 1980. 975. Orson Welles' The Other Side of the Wind is perhaps the ultimate tale of a film trapped in time. Completed in 1975, Welles' audacious experiment, a satire of Hollywood, filmed in fragmented cinema verite style, remained unfinished and unreleased for over 4 decades due to financial disputes, legal battles, and the director's death in 1985. The film's meta-commentary, its shifting narrative structures, and unorthodox shooting style made it nearly unmarketable for the era. Cast and crew labored under uncertain conditions, improvising dialogue and scenes that blurred reality and fiction. Studios feared the public would be confused or offended by the unconventional storytelling, leaving reels stored and forgotten. Ironically, when Netflix finally restored and released it in 2018, audiences hailed it as a masterwork, a time capsule of Welles' brilliance, and a glimpse into the chaos behind the Hollywood facade. The very qualities that made it unapproachable in the 1,970 seconds, its audacity, fragmentation, and critique of the industry, became the reasons it was celebrated decades later. The Other Side of the Wind stands as a monument to the resilience of cinematic vision, waiting for its proper moment in history. Fact hash 4. The House That Would Not Die. 1970. In 1970, a small yet ambitious studio completed The House That Would Not Die, a haunted house story that promised gothic chills and psychological tension. Yet, despite its completion, the film never received a proper release. Studio executives feared the eerie atmosphere and depictions of restless spirits might be too intense for audiences, particularly when combined with the dark, claustrophobic cinematography that gave the mansion a character of its own. The production itself was rife with challenges. Period-accurate sets proved costly, actors struggled with long, nighttime shoots, and director John Llewellyn Moxey insisted on atmospheric lighting that slowed filming considerably. Rumors circulated that some sequences were considered too frightening or morally ambiguous for general audiences, leading to further hesitation from distributors. Ironically, when the film finally saw the light of day years later, it found a devoted cult following. Fans praised its meticulous set design, atmospheric tension, and subtle storytelling that relied more on suggestion than explicit horror. What was once deemed too much became its defining strength, proving that a film shelved out of caution can gain appreciation long after its initial creation. Fact hash 5. The Evictors. 1979. The Evictors, released in 1979, presents another tale of a horror film pushed aside by industry caution. While technically completed, the movie was pulled from several markets, with distributors citing concerns over violent content and potential backlash from audiences unfamiliar with its dark tone. The plot, centered on a couple targeted by a sinister landlord in a rural setting, combined suspense with unsettling psychological element. Behind the scenes, director Charles B. Pierce faced numerous production obstacles. Low budgets forced creative compromises on sets and practical effects, while actors were asked to perform scenes that skirted the edge of physical danger. Studio executives, anxious about public reaction, mandated cuts that altered pacing and tone, delaying the film's wide release. Ironically, collectors and genre enthusiasts later celebrated The Evictors for the very elements that made it controversial. The tension-filled cinematography, unnerving performances, and rural isolation created a distinct atmosphere that modern audiences now regard as a classic example of overlooked 1,970 seconds horror. The film's limited initial release only enhanced its mystique over time. Fact hash 6. The Sentinel. 1977. The Sentinel, directed by Michael Winner in 1977, was mired in production controversies that kept it from immediate recognition. The film, exploring the supernatural horrors surrounding a New York City apartment building and its secretive guardians, faced censorship challenges due to graphic imagery, intense thematic material, and scenes of religious horror that studios deemed potentially offensive. Filming was further complicated by the demands of a large ensemble cast and practical effects that pushed the limits of 1,970 seconds technology. Multiple edits were requested by distributors to tone down violence and certain controversial sequences, resulting in a version that differed significantly from Winner's original vision. The studio hesitated on release dates, worried about reception and protests from religious groups. Ironically, The Sentinel eventually gained a cult following, with fans appreciating the daring atmospheric tension that had initially caused hesitation. The sequences that terrified and unsettled 1,970 seconds executives became the very reason audiences later revered the film. Its journey from censorship to cult status underscores the enduring appeal of horror that dares to challenge societal boundaries. Fact #7 Messiah of Evil 1973. Messiah of Evil, a 1973 cult horror, exemplifies a film too unconventional for its time. Completed with surreal imagery and an avant-garde narrative, studios balked at releasing it widely. The story, blending apocalyptic themes with horror and psychological tension, was considered too abstract, and executives feared it would alienate audiences seeking straightforward scares. Production itself was chaotic. Location shoots along fog-laden beaches and abandoned buildings created logistical nightmares, while the lead actors had to navigate improvisational dialogue amidst dense, unsettling cinematography. Director Willard Hoke and producer Gloria Katz fought to preserve the film's eerie atmosphere, but repeated demands for cuts and clarifications threatened the integrity of their vision. Ironically, when Messiah of Evil finally reached audiences decades later, its experimental style and haunting visuals became celebrated aspects, defining it as a landmark in psychedelic horror. Scenes once deemed incoherent or risky now captivate enthusiasts who value its originality, proving that films shelved out of fear can later inspire new appreciation for boundary-pushing artistry. Fact #8 Death Dream 1974. In 1974, Bob Clark directed Death Dream, a chilling story exploring grief, revenge, and the undead. Despite completion, distributors hesitated, citing the graphic depiction of a soldier returning from war as a reanimated corpse, paired with disturbing social commentary. Such content was thought to be too confrontational and morally ambiguous for mainstream audiences of the era. Filming posed unique challenges. Practical effects for the zombie-like protagonist were groundbreaking yet cumbersome. While the cast had to perform emotionally intense scenes depicting trauma and horror, Clark's insistence on a dark, introspective tone clashed with expectations for lighter, more conventional horror, prompting studio reluctance. Ironically, once released, Death Dream became a hidden gem for horror fans, praised for its inventive storytelling and psychological depth. The film's delayed recognition underscores how content considered too provocative at one moment in history can later resonate as a profound commentary on human emotion and societal fears. Fact #9 Messiah of Evil, alternate regional cuts 1973. While the original Messiah of Evil faced shelving, various regional cuts complicated its release further. Certain versions, heavily edited for violence or narrative coherence, were distributed in limited territories, leaving the true artistic vision obscured for decades. Fans and scholars debated which cut truly reflected the director's intent, adding to the film's mystique. Behind the scenes, censorship boards demanded removal of sequences depicting apocalyptic imagery and intense gore, while some markets even requested redubbing to soften dialogue. These interventions created fragmented versions, further delaying widespread recognition. Ironically, the piecemeal circulation of Messiah of Evil contributed to its cult status. Audiences pieced together disparate elements over time, fostering discussions, analysis, and reverence for its experimental nature. What was once a liability, the shelving and regional editing transformed into a catalyst for its enduring legend among horror aficionados. Fact #0 Don't Look in the Basement 1973. Don't Look in the Basement, a 1973 psychological horror, became notorious for its unsettling depiction of a mental institution. Despite completion, distributors feared the graphic portrayal of patients and staff crossing moral boundaries would provoke outrage. The film was shelved in multiple regions and only saw limited release, effectively vanishing from public view for years. Behind the scenes, director S.F. Brownrigg navigated tight budgets and a confined set, which contributed to the film's claustrophobic atmosphere. Actors endured grueling long takes to capture authentic fear and tension, often improvising to heighten realism. Studio executives, however, remained wary of the provocative content, requesting edits that were reluctantly implemented, further delaying a full release. Ironically, the very elements that kept Don't Look in the Basement hidden its stark portrayal of institutional horror, unflinching character performances, and relentless tension later defined its cult status. When modern audiences discovered it, They praised its raw, immersive approach, proving that films once suppressed for daring choices could achieve lasting acclaim decades later. Fact Hasonon, Shockwaves, 1977. Shockwaves, released in 1977, tells the story of a Nazi-obsessed group of aquatic soldiers terrorizing a Caribbean island. While completed, its disturbing premise and graphic content led to delayed and inconsistent distribution. Many theaters refused to screen it, fearing controversy and poor reception. Production presented extraordinary challenges. Filming underwater sequences with limited technology and safety measures was risky, and the actors performed in harsh conditions to achieve authentic tension. Director Ken Wiederhorn's insistence on practical effects over studio-friendly shortcuts increased production costs and complexity. Ironically, the very aspects that caused hesitation, its unique villain concept, intense gore, and suspenseful underwater cinematography, became hallmarks that attracted cult fans. Shockwaves eventually earned a dedicated following, celebrated for its ingenuity and willingness to push genre boundaries despite its troubled release. Fact Hassan 2, Messiah of Evil, Los Angeles premiere, 1973. Although partially released in limited markets, Messiah of Evil faced further setbacks in its Los Angeles premiere. The studio demanded additional cuts to tone down apocalyptic imagery and unsettling sequences, fearing negative critical reception. As a result, the initial LA audience saw an incomplete narrative that obscured the director's vision. On set, the cast and crew had experimented with abstract sequences and improvisation, contributing to a film that challenged conventional storytelling. When studio interference fragmented the premiere version, confusion and mixed reviews ensued, cementing the film's status as a lost piece of horror history. Ironically, decades later, restoration projects allowed audiences to experience Messiah of Evil closer to its intended form. The delay and censorship that once limited its reach ultimately enhanced its mystique, turning it into a study in avant-garde horror filmmaking and a cult treasure admired by critics and fans alike. Fact Hasson 3, The Legend of Hell House, 1973. The Legend of Hell House, adapted from Richard Matheson's novel in 1973, faced shelving in certain markets due to its intense supernatural themes and graphic depictions of psychological terror. While completed and screened selectively, studio executives worried that its bold exploration of human fear and paranormal phenomena would provoke backlash. Filming presented unique technical and artistic challenges. Director John Hofe aimed to create a palpable sense of dread using elaborate sets, intricate lighting, and practical effects to convey spectral activity. Actors endured long hours in dim, claustrophobic spaces, heightening the authenticity of their fear. Yet the studio's cautious approach led to delayed releases and heavily edited prints, obscuring key narrative moments. Ironically, the same aspects that caused hesitation, the immersive horror, character-driven tension, and creative visual storytelling later cemented the film's reputation. Modern audiences and horror aficionados now praise The Legend of Hell House for its meticulous atmosphere, proving that sometimes the most daring creative choices endure despite initial suppression. Fact Hasson 4, I Drink Your Blood, 1970. Completed in 1970, I Drink Your Blood was controversial for its graphic depiction of cult-induced rabies and extreme violence. Studios hesitated to release it, fearing legal issues and public outrage over the intense content. As a result, distribution was limited, and the film gained notoriety primarily through underground channels rather than mainstream theaters. The production itself was fraught with challenges. Low-budget constraints forced director David E. Durston to rely on innovative practical effects and creative staging to convey visceral horror. Actors performed dangerous or physically demanding scenes to achieve realism, while studio mandates threatened to cut some of the most shocking sequences, delaying any wide release. Ironically, the very elements that provoked initial suppression, the intense gore, audacious plot, and confrontational narrative, later fueled its cult appeal. I Drink Your Blood became emblematic of early 1972 shock horror, celebrated by enthusiasts for its unflinching approach and its ability to push boundaries long before modern horror norms were established. Fact Hasson 5, Scream Bloody Murder, 1973. Scream Bloody Murder, a 1973 slasher completed under tight budgetary conditions, faced shelving due to concerns over excessive gore and morally ambiguous characters. Studios feared the extreme imagery and the protagonist's relentless violence would provoke censorship boards and public criticism. Consequently, its initial screenings were restricted, leaving much of the film effectively unseen for years. Behind the scenes, director Michael Findlay navigated limited resources, creating tension-filled sequences with inventive camera angles and lighting. The cast endured physically challenging stunts to simulate authentic terror, while editors struggled to comply with studio demands for content cuts. Despite these constraints, the original vision remained intact in private prints, awaiting a future audience. Ironically, when rediscovered decades later, Scream Bloody Murder earned a dedicated following for the very reasons it was once suppressed. Fans celebrated its bold storytelling, practical effects, and willingness to explore taboo subjects, turning a once-hidden film into a lasting cult classic. Bonus fact: The Devil's Reign, 1975. This one didn't make the top 15, but it might just be the strangest of all. The Devil's Reign, completed in 1975, faced extraordinary delays and controversy that pushed it to the margins of horror cinema. The film's narrative, centered on a satanic cult and the literal melting of its victims into grotesque forms, provoked immediate apprehension among distributors, who feared public outrage and potential censorship. Filming itself was a logistical and creative nightmare. Director Robert Fuest relied on elaborate practical effects, heavy makeup, and extensive use of color filters to create a hallucinatory, nightmarish atmosphere. Actors performed intense, emotionally draining scenes, often amid cumbersome prosthetics and scorching heat on set. Studio executives, concerned about both morality and marketability, demanded edits that altered key sequences, further delaying release and diminishing the cohesion of the original vision. Ironically, decades later, audiences revisiting The Devil's Reign recognized its audacious visual style, surreal set pieces, and commitment to extreme horror. What was once deemed too grotesque or controversial became a celebrated cult artifact, remembered not just for its shock value but for its daring ambition. The film stands as a testament to how cinematic nightmares, when suppressed, can emerge later as enduring symbols of creativity and risk-taking. Which of these hidden horror films shocked you the most? Were these movies suppressed to protect audiences or to conceal creative risks that studios were unwilling to embrace? Share your thoughts and debate the most controversial scenes, the films you wish had been released sooner, or the hidden gems you've discovered. Did the censorship enhance the mystique, or did it rob generations of unforgettable cinematic experiences? Tell us, which lost or shelved horror film do you think deserves recognition today, and why? Your opinions could uncover the next forgotten classic.